Hey Baruch, how are you?
Great, great. Nice to see you, Mary.
Nice to see you. For the sake of people that are coming in, let's just start.
I'm ready when you are.
Okay, great. So, good evening, everybody. My name is Miriam Hoffman. I'm an elder law lawyer and a gerontologist, and my office focuses mainly on helping senior citizens stay in control when they reach significant junctions in their life. Mainly, we're talking about wills and enduring power of attorney, prenups for second and third relationships, and estate planning. We're talking about people with dual citizenships, Israel and the US. And from my broad exposure with this age group, I noticed that there are lots of other issues that concern senior citizens that are not talked about or not talked about enough. And therefore, I have this podcast for over 2 years now called Golden Topics, Significant Crossroads for Seniors, where I discuss with other professionals all kinds of interesting information that impact seniors and that should be discussed so that people know about them. And today we're going to have the honor of talking to Baruch Labinsky on financial wisdom for oleh. So thank you very much, Baruch, for joining me. And why don't you introduce yourself?
Right. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure being here, and I think you should be congratulated for getting the word out and for helping people in not only obviously in your field, but in related fields. I went out and listened to a number of different episodes that you had in the past, and they're all very informative. And I think it's a big service to be able to help people. Really, there's so much information that people don't know when they make Aliyah, that all of these types of services, the podcasts, the articles, anything that you can do to help people, I think it's a really big mitzvah. It's a big thing to be able to, to help people to to successfully transition themselves to be here in Israel. And you can't take it for granted, meaning some of the things that we take for granted. I know you're born here. I wasn't born here. I made Aliyah in 1993 with my wife, but my family is all here in Israel. I've been involved in the financial world since the late 90s. Since For the last 20 plus years, I've had my own company. I'm a licensed portfolio manager. That means we manage people's money, investments here in Israel and abroad in the United States. And I have been very, very involved also in general financial planning and in helping Olim to transition their finances to Israel. So I've been traveling for many years with Nefesh B'Nefesh, lecturing and helping people for decades now with the transition process. It's about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer, that I also put out a book that, thank God, has also been very well received, called Financial Guide to Aliyah and Life in Israel. And so we'll be talking about some of those things tonight, that when you lecture, and as I'm sure you know, when you're talking to crowds, you go over the same thing over and over again, and it's kind of at a certain point in time after talking to so many people, you're like, well, why don't I just write it all down and get it in a format that it can really get out there, and they don't have to be reliant on just hearing it directly from me. So that's something we did, and in a sense, that's what we're doing tonight also. So
Yeah, I think all these, whatever you talk about is super important. I think it doesn't matter how many times you talk about it. I still think it's very important because other people always hear it. So, okay, so I know that you speak a lot about making aliyah with your finances. What does that mean? And what are some of the things that people should think about when they're making aliyah in terms of money?
right, okay. So it used to always be, the stereotype that when you come to Israel, you need to really prepare to decrease your standard of living, and get used to things like the things that we had to live with when we made Aliyah, not having internet, not having, the regular, a lot of the comforts, let's call it, that we took for granted in our home countries, we didn't necessarily have. And it was like kind of like a step down. People used to think about it in terms of Israel. My standard of living is going to go down, right? I used to hear all the time the line, whatever you're making in dollars in the US, think that's what you're going to make in shekels over here, right? You can expect like a pay cut by three or four times of what you're earning. And it's completely changed over the last number of decades. Israel is really nothing but a financial modern miracle, right? The things that we have today in this country, the development, I mean, we're seeing it right now with the technological and military element of things, but it goes beyond that. The financial, the technological, our whole venture capital industry, the stock market, right there. Israel is really a thriving country, and people can do really well here. And so the approach that people had, which was very much, well, I make Aliyah, but my money stays abroad, I think has really changed. And I encourage my clients and in general, when I speak to people, to take the attitude of how does Israel and the shekel and all the different investment opportunities that we have available here, how does it fit into my financial plan? Right? It's like it really has changed. It used to be that people would keep all their money in their home country and they would use, a credit card to access it, or they would bring over money intermittently in order to, to figure out how to get by, but they would keep everything outside of the country. And really, it's changed. And I think it's really for the better because when you're living in a country, you want to be actually connected to the local economy. You want to be connected to what's happening with the inflation, with the interest rates, with the investment world, right? The analogy that I give, which I think kind of gives it over really well, is if you were living in, for instance, in the United States, and you had an advisor there who said, "Okay, I'm going to recommend that you move some of your investments or to Japan," right? And they give you all the rationale why moving money to and investing in Japan is a good idea. It's got a great investment environment, and I think it's going to do really well. And I like the stock market and the real estate, and there's all these reasons why, right? I think you should move money to Japan. And then if you were to ask your advisor, well, okay, but how much of my portfolio, how much of my life would I put into this investment? Maybe it should be 3%, 5%, it would be like a small amount that somebody would normally think. And if your investment advisor would tell you that I think we should move 100% of your money over there to Japan, you would probably like look at them and like be like in shock because who would ever think of moving all of your money to a foreign country which makes decisions based on the local population, including, what interest rates are, whether or not you're going to be able to access your money, right? You're in a foreign country. How easy is it going to be able to access your money? Maybe they're going to have, deflation, which they've had there, right, for many years. The stock market has not reached the levels that it was in the 1980s in Japan, for instance. So they're making decisions there based on their local population. They're not making decisions based on somebody who invested in from the United States. And it's exactly the same thing with regards to somebody who's living in Israel and has all of their money in their former home country. You're connected with that currency, right? What have we seen, right, in the last 15 plus years with regards to the dollar? Right? The dollar at a certain point in time was just like it went in one direction. It always got stronger. Went up to 4.8. Right?
Right.
People don't even remember that. And now for the last 15 years, we've basically seen the shekel strengthening against not only the dollar, but against like world currencies. It's been one of the, if not the strongest Western currency in the world. So why would you want to have all of your life savings, all of your finances tied up in a different country, right? In a country where I'm not there anymore to deal with the finances, to deal with the bureaucracy, right? I've had clients who have needed to access money. This even just happened very recently. I had a client who wanted to access a certain amount of money for an investment, and they have their major bank accounts in the United States, and the bank wants them to go into the branch in order to authorize a transfer. What are they going to do? I mean, beyond the fact that obviously we don't have any flights right now going back to the States, but even if you're not in that circumstance, right, do you want to be in a situation where you don't have access to your money? You're not integrated with what's happening locally. So I encourage people to think, well, Israel, where does Israel fit into my finances? Where does it fit into my investment plan? Right? If somebody's coming at a younger age, where they're putting money aside because they're contributing to their retirement funds, they're contributing to, Karen Ishtalmuts or pension funds, right? So they're going to have a certain amount of exposure to the local market and to the currency. And that's a good thing. But especially for older Olim retirees who are coming here, and most of their financial center is in their former country of origin. That means pensions, pension savings plans, um, investment accounts, real estate. All of those things are going to be centered in their former country of origin. And they have to think, well, how do I balance things out a little bit more to protect myself in case something happens that I'm not expecting? And of course, we don't know what we're not expecting, right? Because obviously it's not expected. But sometimes things happen in the world, and it used to be, right? We used to have a crisis every decade. There was the great financial crisis. There was like this war. There's that. I don't know. It just seems like there's a new crisis every like year or two, right? Between this war, between Corona, right? Things are happening, and having your finances a little bit closer to home, a little bit more accessible is a really important thing, especially because nobody can predict the future and know what's going to happen in your home country in the long run.
I want to
So,
add to that. I want to add to that. It's a very important point because my clients, when I come and talk to them about preparing wills or enduring power of attorneys, I often have this issue where they say, yeah, we only have a small checking account here. All our investments are abroad, either the US or UK, wherever it is.
mhm.
And I asked them, and how do you handle things? And exactly how you told me. Well, we have a credit card for our account abroad, and we transfer money every 6 months, a year, whatever, to for living expenses here. And what they don't realize is if God forbid something happens to them and they won't be able to do that, somebody else is going to have to do it. Suddenly that's when it becomes more complicated.
Yeah,
And then they have this aha moment of, oh, okay, what should we do? Or even when they pass away in good health and, long, long, long time, just transferring the money out for the heirs is also more complicated. If everything is here,
yeah,
or most of the money is here, it's much easier for afterwards for the people that are left behind. And these are issues that people should take into consideration when they're
yeah,
moving here.
for sure, for sure. And if they have family here, right? Many children, grandchildren, they don't even speak the language. They don't understand the culture in former country of origin. And then they're placed in a situation where they now have to try to deal with, well, how do I now wind up my parents or grandparents' finances in another country that they don't really know anything about, and it's much more difficult for them too. I had a client recently, a couple recently, who told me, and I think it was like very smart, meaning they had some accounts, but they had been here in Israel for a long time, and they said, it doesn't matter if we have an additional tax advantage of maybe keeping the account open in our former country of origin. We just don't want our children to have the headaches involved with trying to access and figuring out how to get the money. And I know it can take a long time to go through probate, and that's not even what the costs involved. I have another neighbor who recently flew to the US again because they're wrapping up they're trying to wrap up an estate. And so the couple had to fly over there, and they're there, and now they're even stranded there. And there's a lot of effort, time, money involved in doing that. And it simplifies things a lot if you also have things here. And as you get older, we all know that life is unexpected. People don't know what's going to come, and what's in store for them, whether it's long-term disability or dementia or health issues, or even just people getting older and no longer able to deal with things financially, right?
Absolutely.
Right? Like I had a client once who she was fine, right? But her hearing was going, and she could no longer speak on the phone and hear somebody from her bank, right, to approve things. And so she wasn't able to like, easily like approve anything or to make any transfers or to just from a simple thing that you're at a distance and it's just more difficult. right? And
100%. Also, a lot of people are on like automatic mode. So I had a client that, Social Security was transferred to their account in the US. And when I asked her why, she goes, "Oh, that's how we've always done it." She actually was in the process of transferring the money back here, and she passed away, unfortunately. Her spouse had to deal with it. There was a and there it became an expensive process. Just getting a lawyer in, it had to get a lawyer
Mhm.
involved. The bank was not very easy to deal with, and all these things could have been. It was a shame. It was really.
That's one of the easiest things that I tell people all the time is Social Security or wherever your pension is coming from, is that some of them, I mean, Social Security for sure, I know you can do it, but I think you can also do it from other countries, that you can have that deposited directly into your Israeli account and
100%.
converted automatically into shekels, right? So it saves you the administrative hassle of like, well, my major amount of income on a monthly basis. A lot of people are still living off of Social Security, and then they have to figure out how to get that money here. So people don't even realize that, like, that effort involved in every month having to transfer, or every couple months. That's work. It's involved. It's planning. So get it set up so that the money comes directly into your account in Israel. And then it's available there and it's available in shekels. And then it's easier when you need to set up your bills because the way you can easily set up all of your bills locally is also in shekels. So you have your municipal taxes and your electricity and your water and all those things that you know more or less that you can budget, that you can have an idea of what's going to come out on a monthly basis or every 2 months, depending on the bill, and you know that this is your money that's coming in from Social Security, and then you can make the smaller adjustments once in a while in order to make sure that you have enough to cover the other expenses, right? And so then you can do that with through an Israeli investment account instead of an American investment account, right? It just you want to set things up in such a way that it's easier for you, right? People don't want to deal with their money all day long, right? Even though I know I deal with money a lot of my day, but people don't necessarily get that enjoyment from having to do that. And I can tell you, especially as you're aging, you don't want to do that. You don't want to be involved in the administrative, the headaches, that the complications involved with the multiple accounts and currencies and jurisdictions. There's like a certain element of just you want to create simplicity to make it easier, peace of mind, so that you're not involved on a day-to-day basis, really having to take care of things.
100%, 100%. So I think we actually, that was my next question, but I think we actually sort of talked about it, about consolidating finances to Israel as we get older because of all these things that you mentioned, like dementia or becoming older and just making it harder for you to deal with things and you don't really want to deal with it. And the hassle it suddenly becomes a hassle. Things that you thought were easy suddenly are not so easy. Um,
Yeah, just I'll mention one other thing in terms of consolidating is just sometimes people think, and there is an element of truth to it in terms of diversification, right? You
right.
want to have money in different banks, in different investments. I want to make sure that my money is spread out so that I'm not taking too much risk, right? And that works with investments in general, and it also works just with access to your finances, right? Um, I understand it 100% when somebody says to me, I don't want all my money to be in Israel. I want to know that I have an account that's somewhere else that I can access. It's kind of like that, the Jewish mentality, which is very valid. We are a diaspora, right, based, community for 2,000 years where you had to really be aware of where your money was and put a plan in place to be able to access it in the event that you have to go on the road,
Right.
right? And so I totally understand when people say, I don't want it all to be in Israel. Okay, so great. So don't have it all in Israel. Have it in one financial institution in your home former country, right? And have it over there. And if you need to have, like, if you have a retirement account and you have a regular account, okay, so have it in one financial institution and simplify it so that it's easier. And then do the same thing over here in Israel. Bring your money over here and have an investment account over here through your bank and a regular account and have it set up in a way that you just It's just easier to manage. It's easier to explain. It's easier to give over. Everything, just it becomes, a much, much more involved process as you age. And you just need to have that simplicity. You want to have some exposure to Israel, great. There's no magic number in terms of how much money you need to have available here or how much of your portfolio you want to have invested in shekels. That's already a personal thing, depending on you, depending on how you view the investment world, depending on how you view, stability here versus there, right? We all have pros and cons. I have clients who want to have all their money over here and they don't want to have anything in their former country. They think, the US is going down the tubes. They think, and I have clients exactly the opposite, but most of them want to have, and most of them it's appropriate that they have a diversification. They have some, but just because you're diversified doesn't mean you need to have 10 different accounts. And you can't even keep track, and you have insurance over there and over here. And I mean, like, I'm sure you're familiar with like the Israeli government that instituted, that Harbi Tuach, and
Yeah,
they have systems in place for people to be able to identify all the different types of insurance that they have
right.
because it was just impossible. People couldn't keep track of it. They didn't know all the different funds that they had opened over their lifetime. And it's the same thing in the US, but they don't have anything there. And people have like there are trillions of dollars of unclaimed assets in the world. And it's not just from Holocaust accounts where people, Elena, that they, lost their lives and had deposited large amounts in Swiss banks. It's also because of just the everyday average person who couldn't keep track of their accounts. And at a certain point in time, it was lost and nobody knew about it. And something happens to somebody and it never gets transferred properly. Right? I'm sure it's something you have to deal with all the time in terms of when you're preparing wills, is making sure that you have a complete list of financial assets. And I know so many people who just, well, I forgot about that one, or I didn't like, declare that one, or I didn't want to have like, I didn't want to tell this person about something else, and just things get lost. So it's creating that simplicity consolidation so that you're not also losing control of your assets because it's more common than we think.
I totally agree. I totally agree. When I discuss estate planning and wills, one of the first things that I say is have a folder with all your, all your investments and all your bank accounts. Just put it somewhere safe. Obviously, you don't want anybody to access it, but and start, adding little by little things that you remember and updating it as you go along. And that is like the most important document that you can give to your family members afterwards.
Yeah, and I would say in today's day and age, the thing to add to that is just digitalize it in some way, meaning save it on a digital drive, on the cloud, and make sure that somebody in your family knows
Knows where it
where
is.
it is and has a password or has a copy of it, or that also is like a very important thing. Um,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, in your experience, do you see cultural differences in the way that Israelis invest their money versus people from English-speaking countries? And what do you think? Does that impact how retirement looks like for them?
yeah, so I definitely think that there are some significant differences. Um, Americans, by and large, are much more tolerant of risk, especially when it comes to investing in the stock market. It's much more built into the culture there in the US that people just put their money in the stock market as they're saving money. Like you can have somebody in there, it's not even just like the early, like when they're saving in their 20s or 30s, people 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, everything that they save, they're putting in the stock market. It's just part of the culture there that they're a little bit more risk tolerant. And they have been taught, and from experience, the market goes up over time, and people have done well. And so they are putting money in the market and they're comfortable with it. I had somebody once was sitting here in my office and I was like asking, like what's their portfolio look like or in the US? Well, it's not so aggressive. I think, we're kind of like moderate risk, something like that. I think I only have about 90% in the stock market, right? That's how they view it. They might have a very small amount that's in more conservative, but they're completely comfortable taking risk. In Israel, the contrast is that the default for the average Israeli portfolio, whether it's in a pension fund or whether it's in a Keren Ishtalmut or whether it's in a managed portfolio, right? The default, right? Let's call it the, more than the average, right? Are invested in what's called the Maslul Klali, or the general investment stream, let's call it, or fund, where they might have 30 or 35% exposure to the stock market. Much, much, much lower amount of exposure. And so, what I always recommend to people, especially when they're younger and they're contributing money into their pension funds, but it also applies to retirees, because even a retiree who's coming here when they're 60 or 65, their retirement savings aren't necessarily going to be used completely by the time they're 70, right?
Right.
Somebody could be living very easily, ad me'av esrim, they say, right, for decades. And their investment savings, their retirement savings have to last them that long. So they also can afford to take risk. So definitely when you're younger, you can increase the risk profile because your money is going to be invested for decades and decades, even before you start drawing it out. And even in retirement, your money is going to be invested for decades, because most people are taking out a smaller amount on a yearly basis, but they don't need to have all of their money accessible. And again, now it can change, right? If somebody has a large amount invested and they're planning to buy an apartment here, so then obviously they don't want to take a lot of risk. They don't want to have a large amount in stocks, because then they're taking the risk that if something happens in the market and then they need their money.
Right.
But most people, when they're retiring, they are incrementally taking smaller amounts of money, and they can afford to take more risk. You don't need to go into 100% in cash or 100% in bonds because I'm retiring now. That's a fallacy. You definitely can still have exposure to the market. Another major difference is that I find that in Israel, there's a major focus on real estate. The average small investor will see, well, what's available for me in terms of investing? It's real estate. It's, how do I buy an extra apartment? It's not as much like, larger types of investments in commercial property and things like that. It tends to be really like, I would like to now have an additional residential property, and people tend to, they try to leverage and put more money and find a place. And people have done very well over time in terms of, exposure to the Israeli market. The real estate market has gone up very nicely over time, although not as much as people think. And even though people think they've done really, really, really well, they probably have done well, but they might not have done as well as they think, right? The market has statistically probably done better than, like, the stock market has done better than the real estate market over time, even in Israel. But having money in real estate, in extra apartments and houses, I don't think you find that as much in the average Western country. People don't always think, well, okay, I'm gonna like buy an extra house and two houses and three houses. But here in Israel, it's very, very common. Everybody has, an extra apartment or multiple apartments. And obviously when things were a lot cheaper, right, people really could put a large amount of their savings and get in with a smaller amount of down payment, and leverage, right, their savings in order to invest. And it was an investment strategy that worked really, really well. It's much more challenging today, as we know, for the average young couple, oleh, whoever it is, to get into the Israeli real estate market.
That's true.
And yeah, it's just, prices have gone up so much recently that you have to really, really think about whether or not it even makes sense for you to buy. It doesn't make sense for everyone who makes Aliyah to buy an apartment anymore. It
Yeah,
did at
let's
one
talk
point in
about that
time.
actually. Let's talk about that. I mean that because Israelis are very focused on real estate, which is so true because I remember I have multiple conversations with different people which were all Israelis and they said, we have inherited real estate or my parents bought real estate and yeah, we inherited real estate and I was told by my parents real estate you never sell. You just accumulate and accumulate and you do not sell it. And this was a person that, I mean, it was very nice for her. She had about 4 or 5 apartments because she got inheritance from various people in the family. And yeah, that was her thing that she was not planning on selling it. It was like something to hold on to, for generations to come. That's how she saw it.
And that can work to a certain degree, right? Meaning you're creating an income stream. There are
Yep,
certain tax incentives here in Israel,
right,
right? You can earn up to it's about 5,400, 5,500 shekels a month and
right,
not pay any taxes at all. And even if you have multiple apartments, you still are paying a relatively low tax rate. There's three different ways that apartments are taxed once you get over that limit. One of them is a flat rate of 10%, which is still a very, very relatively low tax rate here in Israel on that income. So if somebody is accumulating apartments and is renting it out and is creating, a revenue stream, so then that's great. However, all right. We have to also look at the dynamics and the financials involved. Okay. There's something that I always tell people about, which is the rent to value ratio. You ever heard that term
no, I
before?
haven't. No, I
Okay,
haven't.
so it's exactly how it sounds. Rent to the value. How much rent am I earning on an annual basis as a percentage of the total value of the property? Okay, so can you give me an example? Think of a client or somebody you know who's paying rent. How much are they paying rent for an apartment?
Um, about 7,800 shekels rent.
Seven, 7,008,
Eight, yeah.
let's say eight,
7,800.
7,800. Okay. And where's this apartment located?
Where did she say it was located? On the outs, it was somewhere in the Sharon area, but on the outskirts, because Sharon area can
Okay.
be very, very expensive. So
And what would you estimate the value of that apartment to be? Right? If apartments in the greater Tel Aviv area that you're paying that much rent, they're probably worth, again, obviously depending if it's new in the location, but it's probably worth easily 5 million shekels at this point in
something like
time.
that. That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. So if you do the quick math and you say 7,800 shekels is about 94,000 shekels of income a year. And if I divide that by 4 million shekels, it comes out to being 2.3%. So that means the total rent that I'm earning for my invested capital, meaning the value of that property, is 2.3%. So the range in Israel for the developed centers, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Modi'in, Beit Shemesh, it's between 2 to 3%.
Which is
Okay.
not a lot at
Meaning
all.
which is not a lot at all. Like if you think that inflation right now is in Israel is running at 3.4, 3.5%, right? You can buy a bond portfolio and have, returns of 5 to 6% and take very little risk. And yet people are very happy to have their money in these apartments and making 2 to 3%. And if you want to make a lot more than that here in Israel, so you have to move out of the major centers into the periphery.
Right.
And you can do that. And the rent to value ratio will go up in those places. So it could get up to 4 or 5% if you move into like cities like Beersheba and the like. But it's also a very different market. It's a different population. You'll get different types of renters. The amount of involvement that you have in terms of like having to manage a property at a distance, right? And people forget that. Like I know it's a nice income flow when everything goes well, but there's a lot of management involved as well. There's
100%.
renovations, and of course, there's also, the major issue, which is that if you ever need that access to that money, you can't easily sell a room, right? Or sell a balcony and take a little bit of money to be able to use, right? So it's all kind of like a lump sum, all or nothing type of investment. So it can work for a lot of people. especially because Israeli real estate has consistently appreciated over time. So in addition to the rent, you're also earning, you're also getting an increased value if real estate goes up over time, but it's not as much as we think sometimes. Sometimes people think that, oh, my apartment's going to double or triple, in a certain period of time. It's not. It doesn't work that way. And therefore, people really do have to think very carefully whether they want to tie up a very large amount of their money in an apartment here in Israel as opposed to renting. Now, there's obviously downsides with regards to renting too. Renting isn't so easy, especially if you can't find, a steady long-term lease in a location that you want, right? It can be challenging, and especially if as you're aging, if you don't have that stability of knowing that I'm going to be in this location for a long time, having to move often is very, very, cumbersome and a real pain for a lot of people. Um, but I know a lot of people who rent here in Israel, and they're renting because of that same rent to value ratio. They're renting much nicer apartments than they'd be able to buy because they can't put 5 or 6 or 7 million shekels into an apartment, but they can afford the rent for a 5 or 6 or 7 million shekel apartment. So they end up finding very nice apartments in nice locations. And if you're lucky, you might find, an absentee landlord who's willing to sign a long-term lease. Happens all the time. I have clients, who we successfully, help them to negotiate I think it was like a 5 and 5 type of thing where they had a 5-year lease and then they had an option
For another
to extend
5.
it for another 5 after that. And now again, the landlord also had the option, but they were likely not going to be, here in Israel. And so it was a really great win-win solution, you know, small rental changes over time, but it gave them the stability and they could rent a palace, compared to what they would have to sink in terms of their capital. And not everybody can do that. Not everybody can afford to take, that much of their savings and put it in an e-liquid asset. And
Right.
so, you really have to think very, very carefully as part of your Aliyah plan. What am I doing with the housing? Another reason why, by the way, why people, and this is at the beginning at stage, and when people make Aliyah, I almost always recommend that people rent, not just because of the value ratio, but because you don't know the country yet. You don't even know the neighborhoods. You don't know the communities. So you don't necessarily know where you want to be. And sometimes people think they might want to be at an X and they find that no, they really actually like a different community. So it gives them time to acclimate. It gives them time to kind of figure out how their budget is working, how their finances are working and transitioning here. It's like the last thing you want to do is come on Aliyah and stick a very, very large amount of money that you've saved, very, very, your hard-earned savings and chutzlaritz, and you come and you stick it into an apartment, and then you have to live poorly because you don't have the flexibility because you've put all your money into your asset. You really have a lot more flexibility if you rent, if you can overcome, the challenges involved in terms of, finding that stability or, in a long-term contract or in a market that, that has more opportunities, more vacancies or, that flexibility. And I'll mention one other quick point, just which is as people are aging, I'm sure you also are seeing this, and they're also considering moving into assisted living facilities,
Yeah.
old age homes, and they need that extra assistance. So they're in any event going to sell or potentially need the money from their home in order to make those payments.
Right.
And so you also have to think very carefully, like, when am I making Aliyah and how many years do I expect to be living in my home before I really could be entertaining going into an assisted living facility and then making a down payment. And a lot of those places are structured that you make an initial payment and then you have monthly
Payments.
costs that you have to
Right.
continue to pay. So you need to have both. You need to have that lump sum, and you also have to have enough income to be able to pay it on a monthly basis. And so it's like if somebody's here and they come at 55 or 60, okay, they might be in their apartment for 20 or 25 years. But if somebody's coming at 70, they might already, be considering moving into other places within 5 or 10 years. And in that case, then it really makes sense to look at the rental option.
Those are really good points. I never really thought about them. Those are really good points. Well, we're coming to the end of this very, very interesting conversation. Any last thoughts on things that you think people should know about when they're making Aliyah?
Wow, there's so many issues that we could go into. Maybe I'll just I'll make one last point. Just when you're making Aliyah, people have to kind of throw out their preconceived notions, preconceived notions about how they managed their money, their finances in their former country, how they thought they were going to do things in Israel. When you're a tourist, right? It's also a very different experience. Come here with an open mind. There's a tremendous amount of opportunities, and there's a lot of people here to help, and there's a lot of you know really amazing people to be able to attach yourself to, and put together a plan to really help you in a real stable aliyah. um, but you got to kind of throw out those preconceived notions and really learn how Israelis do it, how we all do it over here. And I think that with that in mind, they can be very, very successful.
I like that optimistic note. How can people reach you if they want to talk some more?
Okay, so the best email to reach me at is info@labinsky.com, LABINSKY. And our number here, also the office number is 02-991-0029.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you so much for being with us tonight. That was very, very interesting and helpful and full of information. Um,
Pleasure.
and thank you all for watching. Have a very good night. Stay safe. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all in my next podcast. Bye bye.
Bye bye.